4 going on 14, that's for sure. But they're fun. Fun. All right, what's about 4 after? We'll get started. This is live on YouTube and recorded, so it'll be accessible later. It's a short update. Minnesota did a short update there, or a fairly short suite of changes this year. So we're going to go through the highlighted changes. And actually, the best way to do this is Susan Diori, our chief legal counsel for Minnesota Realtors, recorded a 12-minute YouTube going over the changes top to bottom, and it's really efficient. So I'm going to screen share that. And then after we watch that 12-minute update, let's talk about any questions you have, and talk about a little bit about strategy. But I don't think we'll take an hour, depending on what kind of input we have after the video, but it should go quick. So any questions before we start?
Sounds like a good plan.
Hearing none. I'm going to do a screen share. Give me a minute.
Oh, you got him.
Here we go. Chat me, message me, like, if you please mute.
You're sounding a little, well, you're not the one speaking on this, but it was a little sporadic there, Nick.
The one I haven't hit play yet. So me. Okay.
Yeah, it was sound on your end.
1 second.
Hello, Minnesota Realtors. Welcome to the Minnesota.
Okay.
Remember to always get a plant when you're talking about forms.
Oh gosh. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Realtors 2020.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay.
And Susan was working when you hit.
Yeah, I accidentally hit play on that. So I'm using I'm actually using the microphone on my camera. So if it's not loud enough or something's funny, let me know. And I'll hit play for 12 minutes. We'll go through Susan's updates and then we'll talk about it, okay? Here we go.
22 forms changes. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the forms changes that were made by our forms committee that will be effective August 1 of 2022. Starting with the residential forms, I just wanted to start with the purchase agreements. We made a couple of changes in our purchase agreements. I want to talk first about the financing contingency section of the purchase agreement. We made a couple changes there, 2 main changes. First and foremost, on the top section of that mortgage financing contingency section, where we talked about approval of a grant, bond program, or other loan assistance program, we eliminated that language. We had many of our members write in to express concern about possible misunderstandings pertaining to a buyer's ability to complete a transaction if they're using some of those programs and financing tools, placing those buyers at sort of a disadvantage in the offer process. And so for that reason, the Forms Committee decided to eliminate that language from our purchase agreement. Any concerns about the possibility that the seller had to have contributions for those particular programs, those can be addressed in the seller's contributions to closing costs section. So again, another reason that there was a decision by the committee to eliminate that language. The second major...
All right, I'm going to unmute for a second here. I got to give a shout out to Pat, who's on this call, because he was very instrumental in getting this removed. And I was on the Forms Committee, and I just want to say thanks, Pat, for all your work and writing letters and gaining support. And this is a very welcome change.
Kind of
The
about
change in that financing contingency section pertains to the contingencies. You have 2 contingency options in your purchase agreement, and we made some modifications to the second contingency option pertaining to written statements. Specifically, as you know, currently in our language states that if a buyer is obligated to get a written statement from their lender or mortgage originator and provide that to the seller within the time period that's specified in the purchase agreement. And if they failed to do that, the seller had the right to cancel the purchase agreement by that, if they didn't provide their written statement by that date. And if they canceled it, our current language states that the earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. The same thing happens if the buyer didn't provide the written statement and you got all the way to the closing date and the seller hadn't canceled, but the buyer never provided the written statement. We had an automatic cancellation in our purchase agreement, terminating the purchase agreement and refunding the earnest money to the buyer. Well, of course, the buyer is to be acting in good faith in order to get that written statement. And so the Forms Committee, in trying to address the concern that buyers aren't using good faith to get the written statement, we have an option there now. One of the changes will be effective August 1. You'll have a checkbox option where the earnest money can either be retained by the seller, or you can check that it's going to be refunded to the buyer in those 2 sections under the written statement section, where the buyer doesn't provide the written statement and the seller has the right to cancel, or it automatically cancels if we get to the closing date. This is a very important change and one that you'll want to take note of, because again, buyer is supposed to be acting in good faith to go get that written statement from their lender. And if we do check that the earnest money will be retained by the seller, if the buyer does not get that written statement from their lender timely and gets it to the seller in a timely fashion prior to that date you've specified, and we've checked that it's going to be retained by the seller, obviously the buyer will be losing their earnest money in that regard. So it's going to be a very important change to take note of.
Questions on that change? Instead of doing questions at the end, maybe we just go per update. Any questions on the first 2 updates? With the bond?
That's kind of a big one.
Yeah, with that change though, did they take the date out? I'm not seeing the date.
No, the date is specified in the financing contingency, Jacob, for written statement date. It's governed by the written statement date. If you choose buyer
Different section.
written statement,
Yeah, we
Right.
can't see it here.
I thought this was in that financing contingency, because in the last one, that was where you put it, was either you had the first option, then the written
Well.
statement option had the date.
you will still.
Okay.
You will still, and then this language will govern based on that date.
My only comment here is that it goes to the story that we need to have trusted lenders to work with, because your client can be in a mess if they don't have a lender who follows through and pays attention to that.
Well, and I can say that the discussion through this change in the Forms Committee was lengthy. And one of the points made, Carson, to your point, was that we can't control third-party vendors.
Yeah.
Right, and this is pretty much relying on a third party to provide what the buyer needs to provide.
Right.
But this as all changes, we make a change and we run it for a year or 2 and see how it works, and hopefully it works as intended. But there's kind of a discovery period when we do this too, I think.
Yeah. But also it can be another way for buyers to stand out in a challenging market, where if a buyer has a lender they know and trust really, really well, and if your agent
The other change we made.
Yep. Sorry, Jacob. Yeah.
if the agent knows to quickly check with the lender before you submit the offer, hey, are we good for this date?
It's a critical piece to make a strong offer. I totally agree with you, Jacob.
I
Yeah.
find it interesting that in this case now we have the retained by the seller first, whereas prior to this, in the first contingency option, the one that doesn't involve a written statement, and it has those options, the retained by the seller or returned to the buyer, it's returned to the buyer comes first. But with these added ones, they put the retained by the seller first, which is interesting. I'm just wondering, Nick, if the committee actually had any discussions on the order of this and putting the retained by the seller first and then the refunded to the buyer to the right.
That's a shift. Yeah, that's a shift in the culture.
I can't say, Pat, that I recall a discussion about order. But that's a great point. I can't remember. I know we had a lot of discussion about reworking this verbiage. I mean, this verbiage was reworked in subcommittee hours and hours and hours. So to try to get it right.
It's a small issue, but I imagine in some people's minds, with the one option first, it might lead people to think that that's more commonly used, the more commonly used option. So it's a small issue, but it's interesting to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll keep that on top of mind when we discuss this in committee again. I did apply for 23 committees for this again, so I'll be on.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions on removal of bond or grant? I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, and Pat has pounded the pavement getting that done. So thanks again. Okay, let's move on to the next change. Two big changes. Let's go on to the next one.
Regard. So it's going to be a very important change to take note of. The other change we made in the purchase agreement pertains to the special notices section of the purchase agreement. In that section, we added some language pertaining to discriminatory restrictive covenants. Specifically, we're just trying to inform consumers that discriminatory restrictive covenants are illegal and unenforceable. And it also explains that property owners can remove such restrictive covenants from their title in the county where the property is located. And those were all the changes we had to our purchase agreements.
Questions on that change?
Awesome.
Well,
Yeah.
it's a good thing to note. I would just take the phrase out of there. They are unenforceable, even if they're in the deed.
Yeah.
But people do have to take action if they want that cleaned off of their original deeds.
We had a lot of discussion on the Forms Committee about that change, and many hours of discussion on that change and many viewpoints. But I think we can all agree why it's in there, and it's pretty obvious. The questions from the committee were, the way it was worded initially wasn't quite as smooth as this, and it created almost a point of negotiation between the buyer and the seller. And my point during this change was that should a buyer realize there are restrictive covenants on a purchase, no one wants them. I think we can all agree, no one wants them, no matter what, no one wants them. We all agree on that. But we didn't want to create another sticking point in the purchase agreement for the buyer to say, now you have to get rid of them before I buy it. Yeah. So this puts the burden on of course, us as agents up front to let the sellers know we should probably look into this just in case. And then the buyers and the buyer's agent can do their research on Just Deeds or whatever platform to verify if they're on there, and they can get them removed. So, questions? No? All right, let's go.
All right, turning our attention now to our addenda to the purchase agreement. We only modified 2 addenda to our purchase agreements. The first one is our buyer's move-in agreement. And on that particular addenda, there was only one change, and that pertained to the insurance section. We had some questions about whether or not buyers were even able to obtain insurance, liability insurance of that $300,000 amount that named the seller as additional insureds. So for that reason, we modified the language, and now it simply states that the buyer shall purchase and maintain liability insurance effective on the possession date, and it requires the buyer to provide the seller with an insurance binder. Of course, the buyer is still going to be responsible for any personal property insurance. The second addenda.
Questions on that? Pretty self-explanatory, right? Insurance coverage.
Simplification, that's good.
Yeah. And that's been, a lot of the discussion this year in committee is let's keep it simple. Let's not overcomplicate it. Let's try to simplify the language as much as we can, because not only do agents have to learn it, they have to be able to translate it to clients who aren't professionals in our business. So the simpler we can keep it, the better.
That we modified was the addendum to purchase agreement subsurface sewage treatment system and well water inspection contingency. The only change to this form is actually in the title, where we added the word water after well. And the reason we did that, of course, is to make it clear that we are just testing the water in this particular contingency to make sure that it is potable. There's no specific inspection of the mechanics of the well itself. We also
Now, that's been a big one in our rural communities where we see more wells, and I'm sure Sarah and Jenny have rented this too, and up in our northern offices we see this a lot. Water needed to be clarified because people were assuming that this contingency included a mechanical inspection on the well systems, and it doesn't. So
This is
just
good.
Water, yeah, just a water. Test the water, not the pump.
also added a new form, addendum to purchase agreement, additional signatures. This, of course, was created so that you could have additional signatures added to the purchase agreement in those scenarios where you have multiple property owners or multiple buyers. Oftentimes in estate sales, there might be multiple owners that need to sign. And so for that reason, we created an additional addendum for additional signatures.
Pretty self-explanatory. We've been needing this for a long time, right? Instead of doing an amendment and adding more, or dropping additional signature spots on that document from .loop or from transaction desk, just another simplification.
Yeah, and I've spent way too much time making something up that looks very much like this.
Yeah, right. So here we go.
The most I remember ever having was 8.
Mine was 8 too, Pat.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
And those are all the changes we have for our addenda. Okay, on our buyer representation and facilitator services agreement, we made a couple of changes there as well. And that pertains to the shall or shall not question as to whether or not the compensation that the broker will be receiving from a seller or a seller's broker shall or shall not reduce the obligation of the buyer to compensate the buyer's broker. Now that is language we had in our buyer representation contracts before, and if you recall last year we modified that, and then we heard from many of you that we wanted to make it crystal clear in the buyer representation contract that the buyer shall or shall not have that compensation reduced. When we did have that information in the compensation disclosure to buyer form, although it was, people felt it was a little confusing in that regard. So we added that language back into our buyer representation and facilitator services agreement.
A lot of discussion on this.
Oh my.
Pat and I had a lot of discussion too on this, and this was a change. Like I said, sometimes they make a change and they revert back to a change. My point in the committee was that this is a comfort clause between a buyer and an agent, and that when we can spell out what happens to compensation to a buyer, they feel more comfortable about proceeding. So, comfort clause. For those who have been in the business a couple of years, remember it used to be in there.
We also clarified some language in our buyer rep contracts. Very simple in that these contracts only pertain to property that you are trying to locate in the state of Minnesota. So very simple and straightforward clarification there. We also added another new form. It's an addendum or amendment to any of our representation contracts or our facilitator services agreements, and that is the interpreter appointment form. This is a new form to assist the client in appointing an interpreter and informing the broker that they are authorized to speak with their appointed interpreter. That could be a different language, that could be sign language, whatever that interpreter is needed for. And this authorizes the broker to be able to speak and provide confidential information through this interpreter for their client.
A lot of discussion. This form started out as 2 pages with a lot of legalese in it. And we agreed that simple is better. We don't take on any liability as agents and a broker. We just want to specify who is what, who we talk to, because in a lot of cases, and some people made some really great points, that it may be a 10-year-old daughter trying to interpret for the parents who are, English as a second language clients, and we just got to make sure that we're spelling out who's interpreting for who, so we can acknowledge who we can speak to, because as we know, confidentiality, right, Carson, is one of the fiduciaries in a real estate transaction, and we can't just speak to any old person not party of the transaction without authorization.
I'm sure there was discussion about that almost becoming agency.
Yeah. So that, like I said, it was almost 2 pages when the first draft. And that's what happens with drafts. You know, we draft it up and then we make revisions and we simplify it. And this is a great simple form that just clarifies who we can speak to. It doesn't take on liability. We're not taking on liability for an interpreter. It's better for everyone. Here we go.
I think it'll be a very useful form for any of your clients that would need to utilize an interpreter. And those are the only changes we have for our representation contracts. All right, turning our attention to our disclosure statements, specifically our seller's property disclosure statement. We made a couple of changes there that I want to tell you about. First of all, in the general information section, we modified that section pertaining to homeowners associations. We do currently have a question in there about homeowners associations, but we wanted to bring that out into its own line and also add whether or not it has any shared amenities. So you'll see a new line in there posing the question whether or not the property is part of a homeowners association or has shared amenities. The reason we did this is because there was concern, of course, about any properties where the property is part of a homeowners association and it may or may not be subject to Minnesota Statutes 515B. And so we wanted to highlight this question so that a buyer can know up front, we can start asking further questions or doing further investigation as to whether or not that property is or is not subject to 515B. And if it's not, we wouldn't be utilizing that condominium cooperative addendum in our purchase agreement because it wouldn't be subject to all of those disclosure provisions and other things. So very important question from a seller to understand and know whether or not this property might be part of a homeowners association, even though it wouldn't be applicable to 515B.
Little bit of a complicated explanation.
Yes.
Of course, attorneys right
Yes.
now. It's just a great job. The reason we did this is because we all know neighborhoods where they all share a cost yearly. Maybe it's $50 a year to maintain the entrance. It's not on an association, but they all are chipping in for a shared amenity. This will cover that situation, and among others.
That's a better example, Nick, where I see it is lots of newer construction neighborhoods have some form of simple association like this.
Yeah.
Or a small park or a boat landing, but it's not a CIC per se. She didn't use the CIC language that we see on the forms.
A lot of these in a lot of the suburban areas.
Yeah. So just another point to remind sellers, if you're paying an extra fee yearly for something that's shared, they got to say yes. So,
Yeah.
and then that'll prompt the buyer and the buyer's agent to ask more questions.
And just a thought here. So a lot of these cases, they're not subject to statutes 515B, which means that there's not the required 10-day right of rescission, that the state requires. However, a buyer and seller can negotiate that kind of contingency themselves. So if a buyer, if it doesn't have that state required, the buyer can still ask to see those documents and ask for a 10-day right of rescission. It's certainly something that could be negotiated between the parties.
It's one of those situations, Pat, I think anything is negotiable on paper between a buyer and seller, right? So more strategy we use, if the buyer does need time, let's make sure to give them some time if it's a lengthy review. Good point.
Additionally, in the insurance claims section, you'll notice we modified this section a little bit pertaining to the question of whether or not the seller has an insurance claim related to the property. Previously, we asked whether it was a homeowner's insurance claim, but we eliminated the reference to homeowner's insurance and we're just asking if it's an insurance claim. That is for an example where if for example, a car went off the road and ran into the real property and damaged the real property, it might be the car insurance that covers that claim rather than the homeowner's insurance. So in that regard, we really just want to know, was there damage to the property? Was there an insurance claim? And in addition to that, we eliminated any reference to receipt of the compensation when requiring if the items were repaired. So in other words, instead of asking if the homeowner's insurance or any other insurance, we were compensated by the insurance company, we're just simply asking the seller, were those items repaired if there was an insurance claim?
An important distinction. And there has been situations out there that we know of that where an insurance claim has been made and money has been received and the items haven't been repaired. So I think this is a great addition.
Additionally, in the appliances section, we modified the term invisible fence. We changed that to read in-ground pet containment system. Reason we did that was to be consistent with the language we have in the personal property section on the first page of our purchase agreement. And those are all the changes we made to the seller's property disclosure statement. We did make one minor change to the well disclosure statement. That was just really a correction. We had the wrong line reference number there. So for those of you who saw that, we have that corrected now. And that's all for our disclosure statements. All right, now that I've finished talking to you about all of our residential forms changes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we did on the commercial side. Just a few changes there in our commercial purchase agreement and purchase agreement land non-residential. We made one change, and that was very similar to what we did on the residential side. We added language pertaining to those discriminatory restrictive covenants, where we added language in the notices section. Again, just informing consumers that discriminatory restrictive covenants are illegal and unenforceable, and they can get those removed from the title. We also made a change to the addendum to commercial purchase agreement counteroffer. This was actually a change that we had clarified on the residential side last year. We wanted to add it in the commercial side this year. It was just clarifying that the counteroffer addendum is valid upon signature and delivery of the purchase agreement.
Boy, this is important, and not necessarily for commercial. I mean, we get that for commercial, but residential side, we still see counter offers coming in on listings without a signed purchase agreement. Mm-hmm. So it's important to know that when you're negotiating with another party as a listing agent and they send you a counter, one, it has to be written, counter offer addendum, and two, the purchase agreement has to be signed by the buyer. So you have to deliver a signed PA, checkbox, counter included, with a signed counter. So we have a lot of agents out in the marketplace that aren't really following this like they should. So just so you know, that's the proper procedure in commercial now too.
So remember, the counteroffer addendum is literally an addendum to the purchase agreement. We need all of the other terms of the purchase agreement to make it a complete offer. And so we need a copy of that purchase agreement along with the counteroffer addendum signed and delivered to the other party in order for us to have that offer. Also on our commercial buyer and tenant representation contracts, we added back the same language where clarification about whether or not if the buyer's broker were to obtain compensation from the seller or the listing broker, then it shall or shall not reduce any obligation of the buyer to pay that compensation to the buyer's broker. So we added that language back in there as well. And those are all the changes we have for 2022.
Good update, Nick.
Yeah, questions? I don't think there's a lot besides the important distinctions on compensation on buy reps to point out to a buyer as a comfort. Lots of good things. And just so you know, we're your conduits as leadership here. We can affect change. And so if you see things and you have ideas, talk to me about it, talk to Pat, talk to Carson. We can bring it to committee and get it discussed. And that's important because we're professionals. We do a lot of work in this business and we see improvements. Bring them up. Don't just file it away. I mean, let's get change made if we need to. So,
yeah, if you speak up, you can sometimes influence things, and it leads to changes.
Proof, Pat, in 2022, right?
Yeah.
I think that the getting rid of that grant section and the whole I forget how it was phrased, but the secondary grant, whatever.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I felt very discriminatory and worked with clients who I just didn't like filling that out for them, because I felt it put them at an unfair disadvantage. So,
well, in such a competitive market, to have things that somebody might look at and say, "Ooh, this makes me nervous," was just wrong.
Yeah, so, especially when the biggest program, Minnesota Housing, is a really reliable, doesn't run out, really good
I
system.
mean, just the existence of the language on the purchase agreement kind of implies to a seller
Right.
that this matters,
Mhm.
right? And I had to ask the question, show me data. Show me data that shows that they're less likely to get approved, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I swear I've had more people back out of purchase agreements that were cash than I've ever had that were using, you know, grant bond money or.
That's a very good point.
Well, Pat, and that's what the data showed, right? We asked for data, you found the data, that's what the data showed, that there wasn't a reason to single it out. So that's great. Any other questions or discussion before we break? All right, well, thanks for making it. This will be on YouTube for future review, if I could spit it out. Then I'm gonna send out a quick short email with a PDF that has all the form changes labeled out on it, a 2-pager, so you can reference it if you need to. The forms are updated in Transaction Desk as of right now. The dot loop form changes have been submitted. They usually take 7 to 10 days. So if you need a form, pull it out of Transaction Desk, and you know, I apologize for that overlap, but that's how our form changes work when we're putting it in that system. So give it a little time. Okay.
Good.
Well,
Thank you.